It wasn't a sudden, violent death. It was a slow, quiet freezing, much like the landscape outside the cabin window. For 11 days, the snow had fallen with a relentless, silent fury, burying the world in a shroud of white. And for 11 days, Sarah had held onto a single, defiant ember of hope, fanning it with memories and desperate prayers. Now, that ember was gone. All that remained was the cold, gray ash of acceptance. Cody was gone. She stood by the large picture window of her ranger's cabin, a mug of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands, and stared out at the hostile beauty of the mountain. The pines wore coats of snow so thick their branches bowed in supplication. The sky was a sheet of leaden gray. There was no movement, no sound but the low, mournful howl of the wind as it scoured the peaks. It was a world bleached of life. 11 days. She had retraced the same paths every single day, her own tracks from the day before erased by the fresh snowfall. She'd called his name until her throat was raw, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. Cody. The name was a ghost on the wind. He had been David's last gift to her. They had gotten him as a puppy, a bundle of clumsy golden fur and boundless joy. Just 6 months before the accident, David had laughed, scooping the wriggling pup into his arms. He's a Kodiak bear. Sar. Our Cody. He was meant to be their practice baby, the first member of the family they were going to build in this cabin, nestled in the heart of the national park David had loved so fiercely. Now, David was gone. His memory a constant, aching presence in the quiet rooms. And Cody, the last warm, living link to that life, had vanished into the blizzard. It had happened during the first squall. One moment, he was there, chasing a rabbit near the edge of the woods while Sarah refilled the bird feeders. The next, the snow had descended like a curtain, and he was gone. She had thought he'd find his way back by nightfall. Cody was smart. He knew this mountain. But the squall had turned into a monster, a once-in-a-decade storm that had raged for days on end. The first few days, she'd been frantic, a whirlwind of action. She'd called the Park Service, organized search parties with the other rangers before the storm got too bad, and plastered the nearby town with posters. But the snow had made searching impossible. The mountain was impassable, even for the most experienced trackers. She was alone with her vigil. Now, on the 11th day, the frantic energy had bled away, leaving only a hollow, cavernous emptiness. The silence in the cabin was a physical weight. She could no longer hear the click-clack of his claws on the hardwood floor, the soft thump of his tail against the armchair, the contented sighs he made in his sleep. Every empty space seemed to scream his absence. His bed still lay by the hearth, his favorite chewed-up tennis ball resting in its center. His food and water bowls were still by the back door, full and untouched. Taking them away felt like a betrayal, an admission she wasn't ready to make. But today, standing here, watching the endless snowfall, she knew an animal, even one as strong and as smart as Cody, couldn't survive 11 days in these temperatures, in this unforgiving wilderness. He would have succumbed to the cold, or to hunger, or to one of the predators that roamed these woods. The grief was a fresh wave, as sharp and as cold as the one that had taken David. She had failed them both. She had failed to keep the last piece of her husband safe. Tears she didn't know she had left began to trace hot paths down her cold cheeks. She sank into the armchair, David's armchair, and pulled a thick woolen blanket over her legs. It was his blanket. It still smelled faintly of him, of wood smoke and pine. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the despair she had fought so hard to keep at bay. The ember of hope was dead. The silence of the cabin was her new reality. The mountain had taken everything from her. She was utterly and completely alone. The wind howled outside, rattling the window pane like a cold, skeletal finger, demanding to be let in. Sarah must have drifted into the shallow, restless sleep of the grief-stricken. Curled in the armchair with David's blanket pulled up to her chin, the fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers, and the cabin had grown cold, mirroring the chill that had settled permanently in her heart. The wind still moaned outside, a constant, lonely lament. It was a different sound that pierced her slumber. Scrape, scratch, it was faint, barely audible over the wind, a sound like a dry branch being dragged against the wooden door. Sarah's subconscious registered it first, pulling her from the depths of a dreamless sleep. She lay still, listening. It came again, a little louder this time. Scratch, whine, scrape. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the wind, she told herself. Just the wind playing tricks. Her mind was tired, her heart was broken, and the house was full of ghosts and echoes. She was imagining things. She had imagined that sound a dozen times over the last 11 days, only to be met with disappointment. But this was different. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic. It was insistent. It was the exact sound Cody used to make, his nails scraping against the bottom of the door, followed by a low, impatient whine that meant he was done with his business and wanted back in by the fire. A wild, impossible thought. The very ember of hope she had just declared dead, sparked back to life with a painful, brilliant intensity. It couldn't be. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, desperate beat. Trembling, she pushed the blanket off and rose from the chair. Her feet were numb, her movements clumsy as she crossed the cold floor to the front door. Every instinct screamed at her to not hope, to protect herself from another round of crushing disappointment. But her body moved on its own, drawn by the sound, by the ghost of a possibility. She reached the door, her hand hovering over the cold brass knob. The scratching stopped. A low, soft whine filtered through the wood, a sound of utter exhaustion, tears blurring her vision. She turned the knob and pulled the heavy door inward. A blast of frigid air and swirling snow rushed into the cabin, and in the middle of it, a silhouette, matted with ice and snow, stood on her porch. His head was low, his body was thin, impossibly thin, and he was trembling from head to toe. But when he looked up, his amber eyes, bright with a loyalty that had defied a blizzard and 11 days of hell, met hers. "Cody," she breathed, the name a sob. He stumbled forward, collapsing onto the rug just inside the door, too weak to even wag his tail. Sarah fell to her knees, her arms wrapping around his cold, wet body, burying her face in his fur. He was real. He was alive. He smelled of pine and snow and wet dog. And it was the most beautiful scent in the world. "Oh, my boy," she wept, her tears soaking his matted coat. "You came home. You came home." For a full minute, that was her entire world. The miracle of his return. The sheer, overwhelming joy of it. She was so consumed by her relief that she almost didn't see it. As she pulled Cody further into the warmth of the cabin, she felt a resistance. He seemed tethered to the doorway, confused. She looked back towards the porch, and her heart stopped beating for the second time that night. He was not alone. Huddled behind Cody's larger body, half shielded from the wind, was a small shape. It was a child. A little boy, no older than 7, dressed in a thin, tattered jacket that was no match for the brutal cold. His face was smudged with dirt. His lips were blue, and his dark hair was caked with melting snow. He was shivering so violently that his whole body seemed to vibrate. One small red hand was buried deep in Cody's fur, clutching onto him as if he were the only solid thing in the universe. But it was his eyes that shattered Sarah. They were huge, dark, and filled with a terror so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to have swallowed his soul. He stared at her, frozen, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. Sarah stared back, her mind unable to compute the scene. Her dog had returned from the dead after 11 days in a blizzard, and he had brought a lost child with him. The questions came in a dizzying, silent rush. "Who are you? Where did you come from? How are you alive?" The boy said nothing. He only shivered, his knuckles white where he gripped Cody's fur. Cody, despite his exhaustion, shifted his body slightly, keeping himself positioned between the boy and the open door, a silent, steadfast protector. The freezing wind whipped around them, a harsh reminder of the world they had just escaped. Sarah's shock gave way to the instinct of a ranger, a protector. She had a survivor on her hands. 2 of them. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice gentle, trying not to spook the terrified child. "You're safe now. Let's get you inside." She reached out a slow, steady hand, not to the boy, but to her dog. "Come on," she urged silently. "Bring him in." Cody took a final, weary step across the threshold, and the silent, shivering boy followed, a small, lost shadow attached to a miracle. Sarah pushed the door shut, closing out the storm, and sealing the three of them inside with an impossible, terrifying mystery. The cabin, which moments before had been a cavern of silent grief, was now a flurry of quiet, focused activity. The park ranger and Sarah took over, pushing aside the emotional chaos of Cody's return and the shock of the boy's appearance. She had two victims of severe exposure on her hands. Her training kicked in, a familiar and steadying rudder in a sea of impossibility. Her first priority was the child. "Okay, buddy," she said softly, keeping her voice low and even. "Let's get you out of these wet things." She approached him slowly, cautiously, as she would a frightened animal. The boy flinched, shrinking back, his eyes wide with panic. He tried to press himself into Cody's side, as if he could disappear into the dog's fur. Cody, sensing the boy's fear, let out a low, tired rumble and licked the child's hand, a clear, reassuring signal. "She's okay." Amazingly, the boy seemed to understand. He stopped shrinking back, though his body remained rigid with tension. With painstaking slowness, Sarah gently peeled away his soaked and flimsy jacket. Underneath, he wore a thin, long-sleeved shirt and worn jeans. Clothes utterly inadequate for a mild autumn day, let alone a blizzard. They were freezing cold and stiff with ice. As she worked, she assessed his condition. His skin was pale and waxy. His lips and nail beds had a bluish tint. Classic signs of advancing hypothermia. He was dangerously cold. She quickly stripped off the wet clothes and wrapped him in the thickest, warmest blanket. She owned the woolen one from David's armchair. She lifted him, surprised by how little he weighed, and set him on the hearth, as close to the fire as was safe. Her attention then turned to Cody. She ran her hands over his body, checking for injuries. He was painfully thin, his ribs starkly visible beneath his wet fur, and his paws were raw and cracked. But miraculously, there seemed to be no serious wounds. He had survived on sheer grit and instinct. She went to the kitchen and returned with 2 bowls, one with warm water, and one with a few handfuls of kibble. She set them before Cody. But the dog, who should have been ravenous, ignored the food. He nudged the water bowl with his nose, then looked from the bowl to the boy, and then back again, whining softly. It took Sarah a moment to understand. He wasn't drinking until the boy did. "I see," she whispered, her heart aching at the depth of his devotion. She ladled some of the warm chicken broth she had on the stove into a mug and brought it to the boy. "Here," she said gently. "You need to drink this. It will help you get warm." The boy stared at the mug, then at her, his eyes vacant. He made no move to take it. Sarah looked at Cody, who seemed to understand her dilemma. The dog let out a soft woof and nudged the boy's arm with his nose. The boy looked down at the dog, and then, with a trembling hand that seemed to belong to an old man, he reached out and took the mug. He drank in small, slow sips, his eyes never leaving Cody. Only when the boy had finished the broth did Cody finally turn to his own bowls, drinking the water thirstily before starting on the food. The night unfolded in this strange, silent dance. Every action Sarah took was vetted and approved by the dog. The boy would not eat unless Cody nudged the spoon towards him. He would not let her tend to the small cuts on his hands until Cody licked them first. He was a wild, traumatized creature, and Cody was his translator, his anchor, his entire world. He never made a sound, not a whimper or a word. The trauma had sealed his lips. As she watched them, the enormity of what her dog had done began to sink in. For 11 days, in a raging blizzard, with no shelter and little food, Cody hadn't just been trying to survive. He had been keeping this child alive. He must have hunted for him, curled around him for warmth at night, led him away from danger, and guided him, step by agonizing step, to the one place in the world he knew meant safety. Home. By the early hours of the morning, exhaustion finally claimed them. The boy, wrapped in his blanket cocoon, drifted into a troubled sleep on the rug before the fire. His small hand, even in sleep, remained tangled in Cody's fur. Cody lay beside him, a furry, golden guardian, his own weary body, finally surrendering to rest, his breathing deep and even. Sarah sat in the armchair, watching the two of them, the silent boy and his loyal protector. The initial shock had receded, replaced by a fierce, swelling protectiveness. This wasn't just a mystery to be solved for the sheriff. This was a life that had been placed directly into her hands. This silent, broken child was her responsibility now. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. But looking at him sleeping beside the dog who had saved him, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would protect them both, no matter what it took. The first light of morning revealed a world transformed. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence. Sunlight, brilliant and white, reflected off the deep snow, filling the cabin with a brightness that felt almost holy. Sarah had kept a vigil all night, watching the boy and Cody sleep by the dying fire. Sometime before dawn, she had managed to move the boy, still deeply asleep, onto the soft cushions of the sofa, and Cody had immediately repositioned himself on the floor below, a furry sentinel. With the new day came the stark reality of her situation. The boy needed medical attention, and he needed to be reported. Her heart heavy with a strange reluctance, she went to the wall-mounted phone in the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number for the county sheriff's office. She kept her voice as steady and professional as she could. Years of ranger training taking over. "This is Ranger Sarah Connolly at the North Peak cabin," she said. "I need to report a found child." She relayed the bizarre events of the previous night, trying to make the impossible sound plausible. The dispatcher on the other end was silent for a long moment before promising to send the sheriff up directly. An hour later, the crunch of tires on the snow-packed road announced the arrival of Sheriff Brody. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a face weathered by mountain sun and a pragmatic, no-nonsense demeanor. In a small, tight-knit town like Northwood, Brody knew every family, every story. A mystery was a rare and unwelcome event. He stepped into the cabin, his presence filling the small space. He took in the scene with a practiced, sweeping glance. Sarah, looking exhausted but wary. Cody, who lifted his head and gave a low, non-threatening rumble, and the small boy on the sofa, who had awoken and was now sitting up, clutching David's blanket, his eyes wide with fear. "Morning, Sarah," Brody said, his voice a low gravel. "Dispatch said you had quite a night. You have no idea." "Tom," she said quietly. Brody approached the boy slowly, squatting down to his level. "Hey there, son. What's your name?" The boy stared at him, his small face a mask of terror. He pressed himself deeper into the cushions and reached a hand down to Cody, who licked his fingers reassuringly. The boy remained silent. The sheriff tried a few more questions, his voice gentle, but received no response. He then turned his attention to Sarah, and the questions became more pointed. "Any idea who he is? You recognize him at all?" "No, never seen him before. Nothing on him. No wallet, no name tag on his jacket. Nothing," Sarah confirmed. "His clothes. Tom, they weren't hiking clothes. They were like something you'd wear to school. Thin, cheap." Sheriff Brody stroked his chin, his gaze analytical. "So your dog, who's been missing for 11 days in the worst storm we've seen in a decade, just shows up at your door in the middle of the night with a mystery kid who isn't dressed for the weather and doesn't talk." "I know how it sounds," Sarah said, a defensive edge to her voice. "It sounds impossible," Brody stated. Not unkindly, but as a simple fact. He walked over to his radio. For the next half hour, he coordinated with his office, running searches for missing children in their county and the surrounding states. The answer that came back was the most unsettling one of all. There were no reports. No missing boys fitting his description. No frantic parents. It was as if the child had simply materialized out of the storm. Brody's eyes drifted around the cabin, lingering for a moment on a framed photo on the mantelpiece. Sarah and David, smiling on their wedding day. He knew her story. He knew she was a widow, living up here alone, still reeling from her loss. And while he didn't voice it, Sarah could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air. She could see the wheels turning in his professional, suspicious mind. A grieving woman, isolated, maybe not thinking clearly. Look, Sarah, he said finally, his tone softening. We need to get him checked out by Doc Evans, and social services will have to be involved. He can't stay up here. At the mention of being moved, the boy let out his first sound, a small, terrified whimper. He scrambled off the couch and wedged himself behind Cody, his small hands gripping the dog's thick ruff. Cody stood his ground, a silent but immovable guardian. The sheriff sighed, recognizing a stalemate. The boy was too traumatized to be moved, and he clearly couldn't be separated from the dog. All right, Brody said, heading for the door. I'll have Doc Evans drive up here. But Sarah... He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and looked at her, his expression serious. Don't get too attached. We don't know what we're dealing with here. We don't know his story. He left, and the silence he left behind felt different. It was no longer just the silence of grief. It was now laced with suspicion, with the cold judgment of an outside world that could not possibly understand what had happened in this cabin. Sarah looked at the silent boy, cowering behind her heroic dog, and she knew that she wasn't just his caregiver. She was now his only line of defense. Dr. Evans arrived an hour after the sheriff left, his ancient station wagon chugging its way up the mountain road. He was a kind, semi-retired man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen nearly every joy and sorrow the small town had to offer over the past 40 years. The examination was a quiet, patient affair. The boy remained mute and fearful, but with Cody acting as a furry, reassuring bridge, he allowed the doctor to check his vitals. Dr. Evans confirmed Sarah's assessment the child was suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, and mild hypothermia. But miraculously, he had no frostbite or serious injuries. Physically, he's a tough little nut. He'll be fine, the doctor said to Sarah in a low voice, while the boy was distracted by Cody licking his face. But psychologically, Lord only knows what the poor kid has been through. He's in a state of severe shock. Moving him right now, separating him from that dog, it would do more harm than good. The doctor's words were a small, blessed relief. It bought her time. He left her with some pediatric supplements and a promise to check in tomorrow, reinforcing the sheriff's warning to take things one slow step at a time. But in a small town like Northwood, news travels faster than a winter wind. By afternoon, the story of the miracle boy, the silent child led out of the blizzard by Sarah Connolly's heroic dog, was the only topic of conversation at the general store, the post office, and the town diner. It was a modern-day fairy tale, a welcome bit of wonder in the harsh reality of mountain life. It was this story that brought the polished black SUV to her cabin late that afternoon. The man who stepped out was the stark opposite of the rugged landscape around him. He was tall, handsome, and impeccably dressed in an expensive cashmere coat. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his smile was warm and disarmingly charismatic. Sarah recognized him instantly from billboards and local news segments. It was Richard Sterling. Sterling was a regional icon, a self-made millionaire who had channeled his fortune into creating the Sterling Foundation, a state-of-the-art residential facility for orphaned and disadvantaged children. He was a celebrated philanthropist, the town's benevolent benefactor. Mrs. Connolly Sarah, he said, his voice as smooth and rich as his coat. Forgive the intrusion. I'm Richard Sterling. I heard the remarkable story on my way through town, and I felt compelled to come and see if I could be of any assistance. Sarah, taken aback by the high-profile visitor, invited him in. He moved into the rustic cabin with an air of easy command, his sharp, intelligent eyes taking in the scene. He nodded gravely at the silent boy on the sofa and gave Cody an appreciative pat on the head. A true hero, he said, smiling at the dog. An absolutely incredible story of loyalty. He directed his attention to Sarah, his expression one of deep, professional empathy. I work with children like this every day, he explained, his voice gentle. Children who have experienced profound trauma, the silence, the fear. It's a protective shell, but it can be overcome with the right care. He then made his pitch. It was logical, reasonable, and, on the surface, incredibly generous. My foundation, as you may know, is equipped with the very best resources. We have child psychologists, specialized therapists, round-the-clock medical staff. We can provide a safe and structured environment designed specifically to help him heal. He looked at Sarah with compassionate eyes. You've done a wonderful, heroic thing. But this is too much for any one person to handle, especially someone in your situation. The unspoken words hung in the air, a grieving widow, alone on a mountain. Everything he said made perfect sense. He was right. She wasn't a therapist. She didn't have the resources. His offer was the best possible thing for the boy. So why did a cold knot of dread form in the pit of her stomach? It was his eyes. When he looked at the boy, his warm, empathetic smile didn't quite reach his eyes. For a fraction of a second, she saw a flicker of something else, a cold, calculating possessiveness. It was the look of a collector appraising a valuable object. Her unease was mirrored by Cody. The dog, who had been calm with the doctor and the sheriff, had risen to his feet. He stood between Sterling and the boy, not growling, but his body was tense, rigid, a low rumble vibrating deep in his chest. Too low for human ears, but felt by the floorboards. Sterling either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. I'll speak with Sheriff Brody and begin the official transfer paperwork immediately, he said, turning his charismatic smile back on Sarah. We'll have him settled into a warm, safe room by tomorrow evening. You have my word. He thanked her again for her service to the community and departed, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and a profound sense of foreboding. The world would see a savior who had come to rescue a lost child. But Sarah's intuition, backed by the low rumble from her heroic dog, screamed that she had just met a wolf, and he was trying to steal their lamb. Richard Sterling's visit left a chill in the cabin that the roaring fire couldn't vanquish. His offer, so reasonable and benevolent on its surface, felt like a beautifully disguised trap. Sarah spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet anxiety, watching the boy, who had yet to be given a name, and feeling the invisible clock ticking down. She knew Sterling was a man of action. He was already making calls, pulling strings, arranging the transfer. She had hours, perhaps a day at most, before the official gears of bureaucracy began to turn against her. That evening, she managed a small breakthrough. As she sat on the floor, gently brushing the ice-matted fur from Cody's coat, the boy crept closer. He watched her for a long time, his dark eyes following her every move. Then, tentatively, he reached out and laid his small hand on her arm as she stroked the dog. It was a fleeting touch, light as a falling leaf, but it was a connection. It was a silent plea. It solidified her resolve. She would not let Sterling take him. Her decision made, she turned to a practical matter. The boy couldn't keep wearing the oversized t-shirt of David's she had put on him forever. His own clothes, thin and filthy as they were all he had in the world. She decided to hand-wash them gently in the kitchen sink, hoping to make them wearable. She started with the small, tattered jacket. It was cheap material, poorly stitched, and smelled of wet earth and fear, as she submerged it in the warm, soapy water. Her fingers brushed against something hard and flat hidden within the thick seam of the hem. It wasn't a button or a buckle. It felt deliberate. Her heart began to pound. She lifted the dripping jacket from the water, her hands searching the seam again. There it was, a small, firm lump, sewn into the fabric with a rough, uneven stitch that was clearly not from the original factory. This was hidden, on purpose. With trembling fingers, she found a small pair of scissors in a kitchen drawer and carefully, painstakingly, snipped the thick threads. She reached into the damp opening in the seam and pulled out a small object. It was a locket. It was made of silver, now tarnished to a dull gray, its surface worn smooth with time and handling. It was a simple, unadorned oval, no bigger than her thumb. It felt heavy in her palm, heavy with secrets. "What is this?" she whispered to herself. She was not alone. The boy, who had been watching her from his spot by the fire, was suddenly on his feet. His eyes were fixed on the locket in her hand, and the vacant, traumatized look was gone, replaced by an expression of raw, primal panic. He let out a choked, guttural sound, the first noise he'd made other than a whimper, and scrambled across the floor toward her. Before she could react, he snatched the locket from her palm, his movements clumsy with desperation. He clutched it to his chest with both hands, his small body trembling uncontrollably as he backed away from her, his eyes wild with a terror that was directed not at her, but at the idea of losing this one small object. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, holding up her hands. "It's yours. I won't take it." His reaction told her everything she needed to know. This locket wasn't just a clue. It was the key. It was the heart of the entire mystery. It was what he was protecting. It was what Sterling, in his fine cashmere coat, was ultimately after. She tried to open it herself earlier when he wasn't looking, but it was either locked tight or the hinge was damaged and fused shut. Now, seeing his reaction, she knew forcing it was not an option. The boy huddled by the fire again, the locket held in a white-knuckled grip against his chest, his wall of silence firmly back in place. But now, the silence felt different. It was the silence of a guard, protecting a vault. Sarah looked from the terrified child to the tarnished piece of silver he clung to. The clock was ticking. The wolf was circling, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had to find out what was inside that locket before Richard Sterling came back to claim it. And the following morning, the fragile piece in the cabin had been replaced by a thrumming, nervous energy. Sarah knew she was in a race against time. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a footstep from the approaching, faceless bureaucracy that Richard Sterling commanded. The first move came sooner than she expected. The phone rang, its shrill sound startling the boy and causing Cody to lift his head with a low growl. It was Sheriff Brody. "Sarah," he began, and the friendly, casual tone from the day before was gone. He sounded tired and official. "I'm giving you a heads up. Richard Sterling's lawyers have been busy. They've filed a formal petition with Child Protective Services for emergency custody of John Doe." "John Doe?" Sarah asked, her stomach twisting. "They've given him a label." "It's procedural," Brody said, though he sounded uncomfortable. His argument is that his foundation is the only facility in the county equipped to handle a case this sensitive. And frankly, on paper, he's not wrong. Sarah could feel the trap closing. "And what are you telling them, Tom?" The sheriff sighed heavily. "I'm telling them what I see. A healthy kid being cared for. But Sterling is, well, he's Richard Sterling. He's already been talking to the county supervisor, the judge. He's painting a picture." "Sarah, what kind of picture?" she asked, though she already knew. "A picture of a grieving widow, a good woman, but fragile. Isolated up here on this mountain. Maybe not seeing things clearly. He's suggesting you're projecting your own loss onto this boy, getting too attached, and that it might not be a healthy environment for a traumatized child." Brody paused. "He's not saying you're crazy, Sarah. He's saying you're heartbroken. And it's a very effective narrative." A cold, hard fury began to burn in Sarah's chest. Her grief, her private, sacred pain over losing David, was being twisted and used as a weapon against her. Sterling wasn't just trying to take the boy. He was trying to erase her, to paint her as an unstable footnote in his heroic story. The confirmation came later that day when she had to drive into town for more supplies. The warmth she'd received before was gone. The woman at the general store, who had previously praised her as a hero, now looked at her with an expression of pity. "You make sure you're taking care of yourself, dear," she'd said, patting Sarah's hand. "All alone up there. It must be so hard." It was meant to be kind, but it felt like a dismissal. She was no longer a competent ranger. She was a poor, lonely widow. That evening, Sterling himself called the cabin. "Sarah, Richard Sterling here," he said, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. "I wanted to reach out personally. I know today must have been difficult. Please understand. All my actions are driven by one thing, the well-being of that child. I'm taking very good care of him," Sarah said, her voice tight, trying to keep the anger from it. "Of course you are," Sterling soothed. "But this requires specialists. Sometimes, the kindest thing we can do is to let go and let the experts take over. We have to put his needs before our own feelings." The patronizing tone, the implication that her desire to protect the boy was mere selfish emotion, made her snap. "I'll be sure to do what's best for him as soon as I know who he is. Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cold as ice. "He has a locket, It was sewn into his coat. I'm sure a boy's own property would be part of that best interest. Wouldn't you agree? There was a split second of dead silence on the other end of the line. It was almost imperceptible, but Sarah heard it. A flicker of cold. Hard panic from the man behind the velvet voice. A locket Sterling recovered smoothly. How wonderful. A clue to his past. You see, this is exactly the kind of thing our therapist can use to help him. You've done well. Sarah. Very well. He ended the call soon after. But Sarah knew she had hit a nerve. She had tipped her hand, but she had also confirmed her suspicion. The locket was everything. Her confirmation came 10 minutes later, in a final, devastating call from Sheriff Brody. Sarah, I'm sorry. My hands are tied. Sterling went straight to the judge. They've issued a preliminary order, citing your emotional distress and the boy's need for specialized care. A caseworker is driving up from the city. They'll be at your cabin tomorrow at noon to take the boy into the Foundation's custody. The words hit her like a physical blow. Tomorrow, at noon. The clock had run out. She looked at the boy, who was sitting by the fire, trying to get the silent, stubborn locket to open. She had less than 18 hours to uncover its secret, or she would lose him forever to the wolf in philanthropist's clothing. Panic is a cold, sharp-edged thing. It settled in Sarah's chest as she stared at the boy, who was now asleep, the tarnished locket still held loosely in his hand. Noon tomorrow. The words were a death knell for the fragile sanctuary she had tried to build. How could she fight a man like Sterling? He had money, influence, and the law on his side. All she had was a gut feeling, a dog's loyalty, and a locket that refused to yield its secrets. She gently tried to work it from the boy's sleeping fingers to examine it again. But even in sleep, his grip was like a vice. He whimpered, and Cody, ever watchful, lifted his head and stared at her with intelligent, questioning eyes. Sarah retreated. She couldn't force it. That would be a betrayal of the fragile trust they had built. When the boy awoke with the first light of dawn, he seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The desperation must have been rolling off Sarah in waves. He looked at her, then at the locket in his hand, and then back at her, in a moment of astounding, heartbreaking trust. He walked over and placed the locket into her palm, a silent plea for help. Sarah's heart ached. They were a team, and they were running out of time. She examined the locket again. The clasp was jammed tight, sealed by either damage or time. She couldn't use force. She needed a surgeon, not a sledgehammer. A jeweler was too far away. Her mind raced, sifting through the faces of the town, through conversations she'd had with David years ago. And then she remembered Mr. Abernathy. Elias Abernathy was the town's resident recluse, a retired watchmaker who lived in a small, cluttered house on the outskirts of town. David had commissioned a custom part for a vintage camera from him once, and had been in awe of the old man's skill. He can work magic with anything that has gears or springs. Sar, a true artist. It was a long shot. Abernathy was notoriously cantankerous and disliked visitors, but he was her only hope. "Come on," she said to the boy, her voice filled with a new urgency. "We're going on a field trip." The drive to Abernathy's house was a tense, paranoid journey. Every passing car felt like a threat. Was that a county vehicle? Was Sterling having her followed? She bundled the boy and Cody into the Jeep, the boy clutching his locket, and drove as fast as she dared. Abernathy's house was exactly as David had described, a small cottage overflowing with the meticulous chaos of a master craftsman. Tiny tools were laid out in perfect rows. Magnifying glasses of every size hung from a rack, and the air smelled of machine oil, brass polish, and old, well-oiled clocks. Abernathy himself, a tiny man with a shock of white hair and a jeweler's loop permanently attached to his spectacles, answered the door with a scowl. "We're closed, Mr. Abernathy. My name is Sarah Connolly. My late husband, David, spoke very highly of you." She began, speaking quickly. "I know this is an intrusion, but I'm in desperate trouble. Please, I need your help." She explained the situation in a torrent of hushed, urgent words. The boy, the deadline, the locket. The old man's scowl softened slightly as he looked past her at the silent, wide-eyed child clinging to her leg. He grumbled something about people having no respect for a man's retirement. But he opened the door wider. "Let me see it." Inside, he led them to his workbench. The boy, trusting Sarah's lead, reluctantly handed the locket to the old man. Abernathy fixed the loop to his eye and examined it. Humph. Hinge is bent. Clasp is crushed. Amateur job. Trying to seal it. Or a desperate one. For what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the ticking of 100 clocks and the boy's soft breathing. Abernathy worked with the steady, precise movements of a surgeon, using tiny picks and pliers. Sarah held her breath. Finally, with a soft, satisfying click, the locket sprang open. "There," Abernathy said gruffly, handing it to her. Sarah's hands trembled as she took it. It wasn't what she'd expected. On one side, nestled under a grimy piece of protective plastic, was a tiny, faded photograph of a beautiful woman with dark hair and a radiant smile. On the other side was not another photo, but a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper. It looked like microfilm. "What in God's name?" Abernathy muttered. Leaning in, he took the locket back, carefully removed the paper with a pair of tweezers, and placed it under a powerful magnifying lens. "It's a photograph of a document." He breathed. "A legal paper. I can make out some words. A bank name. Sterling Meridian Trust. And a name." He squinted. "Leo. The name is Leo." Sarah's heart leaped. "Leo." She took the open locket and knelt before the boy. "Look," she whispered, showing him the inside. "Look at this picture." The boy stared at the photo of the smiling woman. His face, which had been a mask of stoic fear, suddenly crumpled. His lower lip trembled. He reached out a small, shaky finger and touched the woman's tiny face. And then he spoke. His voice was a raw, unused thing, a whisper that was barely audible over the ticking clocks. But it was a word. A perfect, heartbreaking word. The single word, Mama, hung in the air of the cluttered workshop, as momentous and fragile as the ticking of the 100 clocks that surrounded them. Leo, the boy who now had a name, clutched the open locket, his eyes fixed on the tiny photograph, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For the first time, he was not just a silent victim. He was a grieving son. Sarah's heart shattered and reformed in the same instant, filled with a fierce, burning resolve. Mr. Abernathy, the gruff old watchmaker, wordlessly pushed a box of tissues towards her and went back to his workbench, fiddling with the piece of microfilm under his lens. "The quality is poor," he muttered, adjusting the focus on a complex-looking apparatus. "It's a photo of a trust document. I can't make out the details, but the names are clear. The beneficiary is Leo Charles Sterling. The executor is Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling, his uncle." A new, more sinister layer of the mystery clicked into place. This wasn't a stranger. This was family. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," Sarah said, her voice trembling with the urgency of it all. "You have no idea what you've done." "Just opened a locket," the old man grumbled, though his eyes held a new softness as he looked at the weeping boy. "Now you look like a woman with a clock to beat." He was right. The drive back to the cabin was a blur. Leo sat beside her in the front seat, the open locket held gently in his hands now. No longer a secret to be hidden, but a treasure to be mourned. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind. Leo Sterling, Richard Sterling, Sterling Meridian Trust. The names circled each other like sharks. Back in the cabin, she settled Leo on the sofa with Cody, who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment and rested his head gently on the boy's lap. Sarah fired up her old, slow laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, the dial-up connection agonizingly slow. The ticking clock on the wall reminded her she had less than 3 hours until noon. Her first search was for Leo Sterling. It was too generic. Her second search was more specific: Leo Sterling and Richard Sterling. The internet, even on her slow connection, delivered the story with brutal efficiency. A torrent of articles from financial journals, society pages, and year-old news reports painted a picture that made the blood run cold in her veins. Her eyes scanned the headlines: tech magnate Charles Sterling and wife presumed dead in plane crash. Sterling fortune left to sole heir. Son Leo, Philanthropist Richard Sterling, named guardian of nephew. Executor of vast estate. The terrible truth laid itself bare on the glowing screen. Leo was not just some disadvantaged child. He was the son of Richard Sterling's younger, estranged brother, Charles, a tech genius who had built his own massive fortune. A year ago, Charles and his wife, Eleanor, the beautiful, smiling woman in the locket, had died when their private plane went down in the Rockies. The crash had been ruled a tragic accident. Their entire estate, valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, was left to their only child, their son, Leo. And the will, in a devastating twist of fate, had named Richard Sterling as both Leo's legal guardian and the sole executor of his massive trust fund. The puzzle pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a car crash. Richard Sterling's benevolence was a monstrous lie. He wasn't a benefactor. He was a jailer. Leo wasn't a ward of the state. He was a golden goose, a living breathing key to a vault of unimaginable wealth. And if that key were to be lost, permanently, the smear campaign, the pressure on the sheriff, the rush to get Leo into his custody, it wasn't about the boy's welfare. It was about controlling the asset. It was about getting the boy back before anyone could uncover the truth. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. She looked over at Leo, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep, the locket still resting on his small chest. This child hadn't just lost his parents. He had been orphaned and then imprisoned by the very man who was meant to protect him. She grabbed the phone, her hand steady now, her fear burned away and replaced by cold, hard certainty. She dialed Sheriff Brody's personal cell number. He answered on the second ring. "Sarah, look, I know this is hard, but the caseworker is already on her way." "Stop," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp and clear, devoid of the pleading from before. "Stop everything. I know who he is. Tom. And I know why Sterling wants him." "Sarah, his name is Leo Sterling," she said, letting the name land with its full weight. "He is Richard Sterling's nephew, and he is the heir to the entire Charles Sterling fortune. Your benevolent benefactor isn't his savior. He's his uncle, his guardian, and the man who stands to gain everything if this little boy disappears for good." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Tom," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper. "The caseworker isn't coming here to save a child. She's coming here to hand him over to his kidnapper. You need to get up here. Right now." The silence on the other end of the phone line stretched for a full 10 seconds. Sarah could hear the faint crackle of the connection, the sound of Sheriff Brody breathing, the gears of a good cop's mind grinding as he processed an accusation that threatened to blow their quiet county apart. "Stay put, Sarah," he said finally, his voice stripped of all previous uncertainty. It was the voice of a man taking command. "Lock your doors. Do not open them for anyone but me. I'm on my way." He paused. "And I'll make a call. That caseworker isn't going anywhere near your cabin until I get to the bottom of this." The relief was so potent, Sarah nearly sagged to the floor. The noon deadline had been stayed. She had an ally. She wasn't alone anymore. When Sheriff Brody's cruiser pulled up 20 minutes later, he wasn't the same man who had left her cabin the day before. The skeptical, weary pragmatist was gone, replaced by a man with a grim, determined fire in his eyes. He looked at Leo, who was watching him nervously from the sofa, with a new expression of protective pity. This wasn't John Doe anymore. This was Leo Sterling, a boy who had been wronged. "Let me see everything," Brody said. Sarah laid it all out on the kitchen table, the locket, the grainy image of the microfilm from Abernathy's Viewer, the printouts of the news articles about the plane crash and the inheritance. Brody studied each piece of evidence, his jaw tightening. "A multi-million-dollar trust fund and a dead-end road," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "It's the oldest motive in the book." He shook his head in disgust. To do that to a child, to his own brother's son. He looked at Sarah. "You were right to be suspicious. My gut told me something was off, but I never would have jumped to this." He looked around the cabin, but this still doesn't answer the biggest question. The Sterling Foundation is 50 miles east of here. How does a 7-year-old boy escape a secure facility and end up in the middle of the North Peak wilderness during a blizzard? Sarah's gaze fell upon Cody, who was lying at Leo's feet, his head on his paws, watching them intently as if he understood every word. The dog was the key. He had been the beginning of it all. He didn't escape from the Foundation, Sarah said, a sudden, chilling certainty dawning on her. Sterling must have had him stashed somewhere else, somewhere remote, somewhere he could disappear from. She looked at the sheriff, her eyes wide with her realization. Cody found him there. His trail. The path he took for 11 days. It doesn't lead from anywhere we know. It leads to the place Sterling was hiding him. Sheriff Brody stared at her, then at the dog. You think he can retrace it? He's the most loyal creature I've ever known, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. He spent 11 days keeping that boy alive and leading him here. He remembers. I know he does. It was a long shot, a desperate plan based on the intelligence of an animal and the faith of its owner. But it was the only lead they had. Sterling knew they were onto him now. He would be moving fast to erase any evidence. They had to move faster. The decision was made. Brody called one of his most trusted deputies and ordered him to drive up to the cabin immediately. You are to stay with the boy, Brody commanded. No one gets in or out without my direct authorization. Is that clear? The separation was hard. Leo's eyes filled with tears when Sarah explained she had to go with the sheriff and Cody for a little while. She knelt before him. Leo, I promise you, I am coming back, she said, looking him straight in the eye. We're going to fix this. For your mama. He seemed to understand. He nodded and gave Cody's neck one last, tight hug. With the deputy stationed at the cabin, Sarah, Sheriff Brody, and Cody set out. The snow was beginning to melt in the midday sun, but the trail was still visible to a dog's keen senses. Sarah clipped a long lead onto Cody's collar, but let it hang loose. Okay, boy, she said, softly, pointing out towards the vast, snow-covered forest. Find him. Show us where you found him. Cody looked up at her, then back towards the cabin where Leo was watching from the window. He let out a soft whine, then turned, his nose to the ground, and with a new, determined purpose, he began to move, pulling them back into the wilderness, back along the ghost of a trail that held the story's darkest secret. They walked for hours, a grim procession following a four-legged guide. The terrain grew rougher, more remote. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to dip towards the peaks, Cody stopped. He stood before a dense thicket of fir trees, nearly invisible from the main trail. He refused to go further, letting out a low, distressed sound, a sound of remembered fear. Sarah and the sheriff pushed their way through the branches, and there, nestled in a small, hidden clearing, was a structure. It was a dilapidated, ramshackle hunter's cabin, its roof sagging, its windows boarded up. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in 50 years. This was it. Cody had led them to the place where Leo's nightmare had begun. The cabin stood like a rotten tooth in the pristine wilderness. An aura of profound neglect and misery radiated from it, a dark spot in the otherwise peaceful landscape. Cody whined again, refusing to get any closer. The memory of the place clearly a source of deep trauma for him. Stay with him, Sheriff Brody said to Sarah, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. He drew his weapon, his friendly small-town demeanor replaced by the focused caution of a seasoned lawman approaching a hostile scene. This is now a potential crime scene. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding as she knelt and wrapped her arms around Cody's neck, murmuring reassurances. She watched as Brody circled the cabin before stopping at the single, warped door. Well, he called out. What do we have here? Sarah looked up. The door's hinges were rusted and peeling, but the padlock securing it was brand new. A heavy-duty brass lock that gleamed in the afternoon light. It was a modern cage door on an ancient prison, without another word. Brody used the butt of his pistol to smash the lock. The shackles snapped with a loud crack that echoed in the silent clearing. He pushed the door open and disappeared into the darkness within. A moment later, his voice called out, "It's clear, but you're not going to like this." Steeling herself, Sarah entered the cabin. The smell hit her first stale, metallic, and tinged with the sour scent of despair. The single room was squalid and dark, light filtering only through grimy, boarded-up windows. In one corner lay a filthy mattress, its stuffing spilling out. In another, A pile of empty tin cans beans. Cheap stew was stacked next to a bucket that served as a crude toilet. This wasn't a hideout. It was a cell. A wave of nausea and rage washed over Sarah as she imagined Leo, small and alone, imprisoned in this wretched place. He was here, she whispered, spotting a small, worn-out sneaker near the mattress. It was identical to the one Leo had been wearing when he arrived at her door. He was here, and so was someone else, Brody said grimly. He pointed towards a small, makeshift fire pit in the center of the room. He knelt and began carefully sifting through the cold ashes and discarded trash with a gloved hand. He pulled out several crumpled and half-burnt pieces of paper. He smoothed one out. On it, the name Leo Sterling was written over and over in a shaky, childish scrawl. But it wasn't a child's handwriting. It was an adult's clumsy, pathetic attempt to imitate one. Forgery, Brody breathed, his eyes hardening. He was practicing the boy's signature, trying to get access to something. This was the proof of financial motive, the link to the trust fund. But it was Sarah who found the heart of the crime. Tucked beneath the filthy mattress, as if hidden or forgotten, was a folded piece of a brown paper bag. She picked it up. It was a child's drawing. The drawing was crude, rendered in a few simple crayon colors, black, red, and orange. It depicted two stick figures. One was small, with a round, sad face. The other was tall and large, with a wide, cruel slash of a mouth and empty circles for eyes. The tall figure was standing next to what was clearly an airplane. Its wings tilted at a sharp angle as red and orange flames consumed it. Sarah's blood ran cold. This was Leo's silent testimony. This was what he had seen, what had stolen his voice, the tall, smiling monster Richard Sterling and the fiery crash that had killed his parents. She showed the drawing to Brody. He stared at it for a long moment, his face grim. The last piece of the puzzle fell into its horrific place. This wasn't just about kidnapping and embezzlement anymore. This was about murder. My God, the sheriff whispered. The full scope of Sterling's monstrousness laid bare in a child's simple, terrifying drawing. He immediately went to his radio. Dispatch. This is Sheriff Brody, he said, his voice now a whip-crack of authority. I have a 1054 at my location. Possible homicide. I need a full forensic team at the old Hunter's cabin. North Peak, Sector 7. Immediately. And get a warrant for the arrest of Richard Sterling. The charge is kidnapping. We'll add the rest later. He is to be considered armed and dangerous. Light him up. I want every road out of this county sealed. As the sheriff coordinated the massive law enforcement response, Sarah stood holding the drawing, the flimsy paper trembling in her hand. This was Leo's voice, and it was about to scream a truth so loud it would bring an empire of lies crashing to the ground. They had him. They finally had him. The journey back down the mountain was a somber, silent affair. The child's drawing, now sealed in an evidence bag, sat on the seat between Sarah and Sheriff Brody, a fragile piece of paper that radiated a monstrous evil. The forensic team had descended on the Hunter's cabin, and the wheels of a massive investigation were now grinding into motion, all because a loyal dog had refused to let a little boy die. While Sarah returned to her own cabin to be with Leo, Sheriff Brody became the calm center of a gathering storm. Back in his office, armed with a multi-agency warrant, he launched an official assault on the pristine, respectable facade of Richard Sterling. His first call was to the headquarters of the Sterling Meridian Trust. The bank's lawyers, who had previously stonewalled his inquiries, were now legally compelled to cooperate. The picture that emerged from the financial records was one of audacious, systematic plunder. Working with a state financial crimes investigator, Brody uncovered a breathtaking web of deceit. Richard Sterling, a man celebrated for his charity, had been using his nephew's inheritance as a personal slush fund. Millions had been siphoned from Leo's trust through a series of complex wire transfers into shell corporations and offshore accounts. His own businesses, which appeared successful on the surface, were failing spectacularly. He was on the verge of bankruptcy. Leo's inheritance wasn't just supplementing his lifestyle, it was the only thing keeping his fraudulent empire from collapsing. Meanwhile, a brief, tense scene was playing out in Richard Sterling's luxurious office 50 miles away. His calls to the sheriff were going unanswered. A junior bank manager had nervously informed him that all activity on the Sterling Meridian Trust was now frozen, pending a law enforcement investigation. The caseworker he had sent to the mountain had been intercepted and sent back. His charming mask cracked. He swept the expensive crystal paperweights from his desk with a snarl of pure fury. She had done this, the grieving little park ranger and her wretched dog. They had unearthed a secret he thought was buried under a mountain of snow and silence. He was a man with everything to lose. And he knew exactly who to blame. His desperation curdled into a singular, venomous purpose. Back in Northwood, Sheriff Brody made his next call, this one to the federal agent who had originally overseen the investigation into the Sterling plane crash. He explained the situation: the imprisoned child, the financial motive, the forgery. Then, he emailed a high-resolution scan of Leo's drawing. The federal agent was silent for a long moment after viewing the image of the smiling man beside the burning plane. "We're reopening the case, Sheriff," he said, his voice grim. "Effective immediately. I have a team pulling the wreckage analysis from the archives right now. We're going to look for anything we might have missed, anything that looked like tampering." The case had gone from a local kidnapping to a multi-state financial conspiracy and a potential double homicide. Brody called Sarah to update her. As he relayed the details of Sterling's brazen theft and the new suspicions surrounding the plane crash, Sarah felt a profound sickness. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a calculated, monstrous plan. Sterling hadn't just found himself in a position of power over Leo. He had likely created that position by murdering his own family. He had imprisoned a traumatized child, planning to either let him disappear in the wilderness or forge his signature until he was old enough to be disposed of more permanently. The man was not just a criminal. He was a monster. The problem? "Sarah," Brody said, his voice pulling her back to the present, "is that he's gone to ground. He's not at his office, not at his mansion. He's in the wind." "He's running," Sarah asked, a sliver of hope in her voice. "I don't think so," the sheriff said, and the grimness in his tone sent a fresh chill down Sarah's spine. A man like Sterling, a narcissist with a god complex. He doesn't run. He retaliates. He doesn't see this as being caught. He sees it as being wronged. He's going to try and eliminate the source of his problem. The implication was terrifyingly clear. "I'm sending a patrol car to sit at the bottom of your road, Sarah. But it's a long way up. He knows the woods. He knows how to be invisible." The sheriff's final words were a stark warning. "Lock your doors. Keep Cody close. Because he's not running from us. I'm betting everything he's coming for you." The sun began its descent, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of orange and blood red. Inside the cabin, the beauty of the sunset was lost on Sarah. Sheriff Brody's warning echoed in the quiet rooms, turning their cozy sanctuary into a fragile fortress. She was no longer waiting for a caseworker. She was waiting for a monster. Her training as a ranger kicked in, a cold, clear stream of logic cutting through the fear. She moved with purpose, checking the locks on every window and door. She drew the thick curtains, shutting out the dying light and the watching eyes she imagined were already there. She went to the tall gun safe that had belonged to David, her hands steady as she entered the combination. She pulled out his old hunting rifle, a familiar and reassuring weight in her hands. She checked the chamber. It was loaded. Leo watched her, his eyes wide, but he didn't seem afraid. He seemed to be drawing strength from her calm resolve. "We're going to play a quiet game tonight, Leo," she said, her voice even. "We're going to stay right here by the fire, and Cody is going to stay with us." The dog needed no encouragement. He had been on edge ever since Sarah's tense phone call with the sheriff. He now paced restlessly before the hearth, a low, constant growl vibrating in his chest. He was a furry, golden storm cloud, sensing the drop in atmospheric pressure that precedes a lightning strike. Night fell completely, blanketing the mountain in an impenetrable darkness. The only light came from the roaring fire in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Every creak of the old cabin, every skittering sound of the wind, made Sarah's heart leap into her throat. The first sign that they were no longer alone came with an unnerving suddenness. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. The entire cabin was plunged into an abrupt, shocking darkness, save for the primal, flickering light of the fire. "He's here," Sarah whispered. Sterling knew the woods. He would have known where to find the cabin's external generator and fuse box. He had cut them off. He had isolated them. She pulled a terrified Leo behind the large stone fireplace, which offered the most solid cover. She raised the rifle, resting it on the stone mantel, its barrel pointed towards the main door. Cody stood before them, a silent, snarling statue of golden fur. Then came the voice. It drifted from the darkness outside, a chilling parody of the charming, benevolent tone he had used before. "Sarah, I know you're in there. There's no need for this to be unpleasant." Sarah remained silent, her breath held tight in her chest. "The boy is my nephew." "Sarah. He belongs with me," the voice continued, circling the cabin now. "You are interfering in a private family matter. Give him to me, and I will walk away. I will even see to it that the authorities overlook your part in this unfortunate misunderstanding." His voice was a venomous caress, a predator's attempt to soothe its prey before the final strike. "Think about your husband, Sarah," the voice called out. "Closer now, just outside the front window. He wouldn't have wanted you to get hurt protecting something that isn't yours." The mention of David sent a spike of white-hot rage through her. How dare he use her husband's memory against her? She remained silent, her grip tightening on the rifle stock. Her silence seemed to infuriate him. The time for psychological games was over. Crash. The sound of shattering glass erupted from the back of the cabin, from the direction of the kitchen. It was a classic diversionary tactic, meant to draw her attention, to make her move from her fortified position. Cody erupted in a frenzy of furious barking. Leo let out a small, terrified cry and buried his face in Sarah's side. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't move. She kept the rifle trained on the front of the house, her eyes scanning the dark doorways that led from the kitchen and hallway into the main room. He wasn't coming through the broken window. He was coming through the door he had just unlocked from the inside. A floorboard creaked in the darkened hallway. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows. Richard Sterling stepped into the firelight, his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He held a heavy tire iron in his hand. Richard Sterling stood in the entrance to the living room, a predator silhouetted against the darkness, the tire iron held loosely in his hand. The firelight danced across his face, illuminating the crazed, possessive gleam in his eyes. All traces of the charming philanthropist were gone, stripped away to reveal the monster beneath. "Now," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "We will end this foolishness. Give me the boy." Sarah. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when she spoke, was as cold and steady as the rifle she held. "You are not taking him." "Richard." Sterling let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Don't be a fool. A park ranger with her husband's old rifle. You think you can stop me?" He took a step into the room. "He is my blood, my responsibility, my property. You have interfered enough. He is a child who you terrorized and imprisoned," Sarah retorted, her words like chips of ice. "A child whose parents you likely murdered. You will not touch him, for a moment." Her words seemed to stun him, the raw truth of the accusation hitting him like a physical blow. But a cornered animal does not reason. It attacks. With a roar of pure rage, he lunged, not at Sarah, but towards the fireplace, towards the small shape of Leo cowering behind it. He was a blur of motion, desperate and reckless, but he underestimated the guardian of the hearth. Before Sarah could even adjust her aim, Cody exploded into action. It was not a bark or a growl, it was a roar, a deep, primal sound of absolute fury unleashed. He launched himself through the air, a 70-pound missile of golden fur and righteous rage. He met Sterling mid-lunge, his powerful jaws closing around the arm that held the tire iron. The impact was brutal. Sterling screamed, a high-pitched sound of pain and surprise, as Cody's weight and momentum sent him stumbling sideways. The tire iron clattered to the floor. Sterling thrashed wildly, trying to shake the dog off, but Cody held on with the tenacity of a wolf, his entire body shaking with the effort of pinning the much larger man. He wasn't just biting, he was defending. He was a guardian holding the line. The selfless act gave Sarah the opening she needed. Her mind was a flash of cold clarity. She did not fire the gun. That was a messy, unpredictable end. Instead, as Sterling struggled, she reversed the rifle, gripping the barrel like a bat. With all her strength, she swung the heavy wooden stock in a short, powerful arc, connecting solidly with the side of Sterling's head. The crack was sickeningly loud. Sterling's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap, unconscious. Cody immediately let go, panting heavily, a trickle of blood from Sterling's arm on his muzzle. He stood over the fallen man, a low growl still rumbling in his chest, ensuring the threat was neutralized. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the panting of the dog, and Sarah's own ragged breaths. She stood over Sterling's unconscious form, the rifle held ready, her body trembling with the massive surge of adrenaline. It was in this tableau that the front door burst open. Sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody stood in the doorway, weapon drawn, flanked by 2 deputies. They had seen the cut power lines and had known the confrontation was imminent. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene, the shattered window, the fallen philanthropist, the heroic dog standing guard, and the lone woman with a rifle in her hands, protecting her child. Brody took in the scene in a second, his eyes landing on the unconscious form of Richard Sterling. "Well, I'll be," he said, holstering his weapon. "Looks like you handled the welcoming committee." As the deputies moved in to secure and handcuff the unconscious Sterling, Sarah finally lowered the rifle. Her strength gave out, and she sank to her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably. Cody was instantly at her side, nudging her, licking her face. Leo peeked out from behind the fireplace. Seeing the monster on the floor and the police in control, he ran to Sarah. He threw his small arms around both her and the dog, burying his face in Cody's fur. Sarah wrapped her arms around them both. A boy and his dog, her family. The sirens wailed outside, a sound of justice arriving. The battle was over. The monster had been vanquished. They were safe. 1 year later, the mountain was vibrant with the thrum of summer life. The meadows that had been buried under feet of snow were now a tapestry of wildflowers, and the air, once sharp with ice, was now warm and sweet with the scent of pine and sun-baked earth. The cabin on North Peak was no longer a fortress against the world, but a peaceful, open home, its porch door usually ajar to let in the breeze. Richard Sterling was never a threat again. His trial had been a media sensation. The story of the corrupt philanthropist and the boy he'd tried to erase dominating the news for weeks. The evidence, the forged documents, the financial trail. Leo's heartbreaking drawing was insurmountable. Convicted on a mountain of charges ranging from kidnapping to massive fraud and conspiracy, he would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security federal prison, a monster confined to a cage of his own making. The full truth of his brother's accidental death was never proven definitively in court, but no one had any doubt of his guilt. Justice had been served, but the real healing happened far from any courtroom, on the quiet mountain where the story began. Leo was no longer the silent boy. His voice, once a lost whisper, was now clear and bright, though he remained a thoughtful and quiet child. With therapy and the unwavering security of Sarah's love, he had begun to process his immense trauma. He attended the small school in Northwood, where he was slowly making friends. He loved to fish in the mountain streams and knew the names of all the constellations. The shadows in his eyes had not vanished completely, but they were now outnumbered by the stars. Sarah had been reborn. The hollow, grieving woman who had haunted the cabin was gone. In her place was a mother, her life filled with the joyful chaos of school projects, bedtime stories, and bandaging scraped knees. She had officially adopted Leo, a process overseen by the new ethical board of trustees now managing his fortune, but the legal papers were merely a formality. He had been her son from the moment he'd huddled behind her dog on that stormy night. The memory of David was no longer a source of constant pain, but a gentle, loving presence she could now share with Leo, telling him stories of the brave, kind man who had loved this mountain so much. And Cody, the hero of the hour, wore his fame with a humble dignity. He had been given a medal for heroism by the county, an event that amused Sarah greatly. But his true reward was this, his pack, whole and happy. He spent his days chasing squirrels with Leo, and his evenings lying at Sarah's feet, his head resting on her boots, his deep, contented sighs filling the warm air. His loyalty had been the thread that had stitched their broken lives back together. One warm evening, the three of them sat on the porch steps, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks. Leo leaned against Sarah, pointing out a hawk circling high above. Cody rested his head on Leo's knee, his tail thumping a soft rhythmic beat against the wooden steps. They were a strange, unlikely trio, a pack forged in a blizzard, bound not by blood, but by a bond far stronger. A woman who had lost her family, a boy who'd had his stolen from him, and a dog who had braved the wilderness to bring them together. They had faced the very worst of human darkness, and had found the very best of loyalty and love, looking out at the vast, peaceful wilderness that was their home. Sarah wrapped her arms around her son, her hand resting on her dog's warm fur. The silence that surrounded them was no longer empty. It was full. It was peace.